The funny thing to me is that the government is trying to make the case that this is an organized leftist cell. But what I see is a lot of disorganization.
Yeah, I mean, I make the joke all the time that, like, I wish there was an organized leftist movement at the level that the federal government seems to be terrified that there is. I wish we were that organized, you know?
Hey, everyone. It's Mary Harris from Slate's What Next podcast. Popping into this feed because right now there is this trial going on in Fort Worth, Texas, and I really think a lot more people need to be paying attention to it. This trial is all about what happened last year on July 4th at an ICE detention facility. Some protesters showed up, but they had fireworks with them. Allegedly, they started spray painting things like cars, and then the cops came, and a police officer was shot. Now the authorities are alleging that what went down that night was all the result of planning by a North Texas Antifa cell. Now, there are a lot of people that doubt that this Antifa cell ever existed. But charging folks in this way has meant it's not just the shooter on trial. It's also 8 other people who are charged with supporting terrorism. And attorneys have started to wonder if this is just a new way for the administration to go after people who disagree with it. Protesters, whether they're peaceful or not. So I called up an attorney, Leeja Miller, to talk to me all about it. Leeja is all over YouTube, so you may know her already. She has her own show. It's called Why America, which is a great name for a show. Here's my conversation with Leeja. My understanding is that this trial is taking place in a tiny courtroom, and the facts are actually complicated and interesting. Like, what happened is that a group of protesters showed up for what they called to themselves a July 4th party. And by the end of the night, a police lieutenant is shot, non-fatally, but shot. He was shot by one person, but 9 people are on trial here. Why?
9 people are on trial and 16 people total have been charged. 7 have pled guilty. And a lot of it is charges stemming from actions that happened after the protest, because the one man who fired the gun then was kind of on the run for a while, and people did things.
He evaded arrest for something like 11 days, I think.
Right. And then allegedly a lot of the people in the indictment then aided him. And because they're saying he is an alleged domestic terrorist, that means that they were providing material support to him.
One thing I have trouble doing looking at this case is figuring out what exactly the protesters were trying to do here. Like, one protester told a local news outlet this was supposed to be a noise demonstration, a joyful show of support for immigrants inside the ICE facility. And I struggle with it because I'm like, if you're going to have a joyful celebration, like, just maybe leave the body armor home or the guns like home. You know what I mean? Like, I think that's where my brain begins to scramble. Is that fair of me?
Yeah. You know, I mean, I think I'm certainly biased against the administration. So it's hard to, you know, I'm not the lawyer. I'm not the jury. I have, you know, my biases. But I think from what I've heard from some of the defendants is that it was a demonstration, perhaps at the beginning, that was meant to be a joyful show of support that kind of got out of hand. But at the same time, yes, they showed up armed and I believe it was in the evening, and they were all wearing black, and you know, it's
purposefully, so they couldn't be identified as individuals. Yeah,
correct. I'm not going to necessarily be quick to say that they, you know, and all of these are, of course, alleged facts at this point, that they were necessarily going in planning any sort of shooting, any sort of violence. I know that there was some testimony from, I believe it was one of the defendants that pled guilty, talking about how afterwards she was distraught and upset and crying because of the shooting that took place, because she was not anticipating that would happen. And, if they're coming from a place of being inherently distrustful of the government, and they're in Texas where guns are pretty normalized. I've not been there, but that's what I hear about Texas. It seems to me that it's not that taking it to a step and saying this was a planned attack is a bridge too far.
Yeah. I mean, you've noted that the investigation into what took place here initially followed a kind of normal trajectory that you might expect as an attorney. The FBI conducted a raid on the homes of suspected organizers. There were search warrants, stuff that would be usual to try to get to the bottom of who was there, what were they planning, all that sort of stuff. But then you say things changed. Can you explain what changed and why? Like how this became an investigation into how an officer was shot amongst a crowd of people, into is this crowd of people an Antifa cell?
I don't want to pin it on one specific instigating incident, but the murder of Charlie Kirk certainly didn't help the defendants in this case.
How do you draw that line?
Yeah, so the incident happened on July 4th. The investigation gets underway. And then you have Charlie Kirk murdered in September, early September. By the end of September, you've got the president issuing an executive order saying that designating Antifa as a domestic terrorist organization, which there is no mechanism by which to designate a domestic terror organization the way that we have for a foreign terrorist organization. So even that order in itself is legally questionable. And then you have NSPM 7, which was the National Security Presidential Memorandum 7, which basically was directing the FBI, Pam Bondi, et cetera, to start cracking down on what the administration claims is domestic terrorism.
For people who maybe don't know what this memo is, can you just explain it a little bit?
So the NSPM 7 offers a very specific list of what the administration considers to be the ideology that ties together these domestic terrorists that they're most concerned about, which includes things like anti-Americanism, anti-capitalism, gender extremism.
Very broad.
Yes, very broad and very much protected by the First Amendment, most of the things on this list. Trump asks the FBI and Pam Bondi to start cracking down. Pam Bondi then issues her own memo internally with the DOJ, instructing the DOJ to start cracking down on domestic terrorism and to even go back a few years into their files and see if they can find any sort of Antifa-linked activity. They tried to attach the alleged murder of Charlie Kirk to Antifa. So this all kind of culminated in November, a superseding indictment being filed against the defendants in this case, adding allegations of conspiracy or providing material support to terrorists, which adds a new layer to the case because it increases the severity of potential punishment, not only for the people that are being charged with providing material support to terrorists, but also the people who are being charged or accused of being domestic terrorists, because even if there's not a charging statute that says you are a domestic terrorist, there are sentencing guidelines and other means by which the prosecution can then ask for harsher punishment. And Pam Bondi is interested in creating a database of domestic terrorists, so you could be added to this domestic terrorist database for life, which obviously would then impact your ability to get a job, pay rent, get a rental, travel anywhere in the world. And some of these people are now facing up to life in prison because of these more intensive charges that were added in the wake of all these presidential orders.
Wow. So that leads us to where we are now, which is this trial is ongoing in Texas. And this thing has happened where some protesters from that evening have decided, I will make a deal with the government, an agreement to testify in this case and explain what was happening among the protesters. And one of these folks, his name is Seth Sykes, he testified, I thought I was just going to a noise demonstration in front of this detention facility. He knew everyone involved, including the shooter. And, you know, he said, listen, we were leftists, but we were essentially a bunch of people with a bunch of different ideas. And point blank said, like, Antifa isn't a thing. It's a blanket term for different groups on the left, and we only use this name to describe ourselves as a joke. Which to me, I look at all of this and I'm like, the idea that you would look at this pile of evidence and say, this is a terrorist cell, it is Antifa, it feels like a difficult argument to make, essentially. I don't know if you see it that way.
I think it is a difficult argument to make because a lot of this is they're trying to prove intent. They're trying to prove that the people that they have accused of providing material support to terrorists intended for their material support to go towards terroristic acts. And the government's own witnesses now that have made this plea deal are making it harder for them. They're saying things that contradict the idea that this is some highly organized, cell of people with the same ideology. Because when they're being asked on the stand about their beliefs or about their shared beliefs in the group, they're getting really wishy-washy answers which indicates to me that there was no shared ideology among the group, that it was more of a social group of people who generally share leftist ideas, which is, again, not a crime and very protected by the First Amendment, who all went to a protest together that got out of hand. And they're trying to create this larger conspiracy that might not be there.
Yeah. I mean, the funny thing to me is that the government is trying to make the case that this is an organized leftist cell. But what I see is a lot of disorganization, frankly. Like people with different motives, there's no plan according to the people who are getting on the stand. It's maybe not what you'd imagine if you were thinking cell, you know?
Yeah, I mean, I make the joke all the time that, like, I wish there was an organized leftist movement at the level that the federal government seems to be terrified that there is. I wish we were that organized, you know? And I think that kind of gets to the nature of organizing and movement building and protesting, which is something I've seen here on the ground in Minneapolis and watched kind of form in real time. It's messy. A lot of times it's not organized. A lot of times it's a lot of disparate people coming together because they believe in one general idea, which perhaps in this case was feelings of that they don't support ICE and that they don't support the immigration tactics of this administration. And it's usually not highly organized. This is not like a paramilitary force that has invaded the United States the way that I think a lot of people in this administration either genuinely believe or would like the public to believe. And so we're seeing that in action. And that's not to say that like this type of organizing isn't effective or isn't worthwhile or isn't sophisticated. It's just the fact of organizing. It's messy. And so trying to prove that there's this overarching ideology and conspiracy to commit specific acts in the way that the government is claiming, it's falling apart because it's never been true.
So we've talked about how the evidence here seems thin for this domestic terrorism charge. Do you think that's going to matter in the end? Like, how much do you think that will matter? I guess we don't know because this is so new.
Right. It's so new. And also the statute that they are being charged under when it comes to the providing material support to terrorists doesn't require that they prove that every defendant was a member of this so-called Antifa cell.
What do they have to prove?
They have to show that the person providing the material support intended to support the actual act of the actual underlying crime, not just that they generally supported the ideology of the person accused of committing the crime.
So I provided this support knowing that a shooting would happen on the other end of it?
Right. Or that or that any of the crimes that they're being accused of was going to happen. And that's another piece of this that gets complicated because they're also including crimes like spray painting and property damage. And so they're kind of trying to say that what would be a misdemeanor charge maybe should be trumped up to 15 years in prison because what they're doing was also providing material support to a terrorist or to someone who is violating these laws.
That's interesting. So it's like, it's possible that if you can prove that, well, they intended to spray paint a car or whatever while they were there and they provided support for that, you can now be guilty of this terrorism charge, which, man, that's a lot for spray painting a car.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's important because it's like the top line of this is always going to be an officer was shot, right?
Mm-hmm.
But what you're saying is like these big charges may actually ride on these much lower down things that happened that same night, which is people letting off fireworks, people spray painting things. And so in the end, like this very large charge that you'll kind of understand as part of this big event where an officer was shot. They're not saying like you planned the shooting. They're saying you planned a protest, essentially, that involved spray painting.
Right. And that's why, watching how the federal government tries to argue this case and seeing how the outcome of this case, what it is, could have bigger effects across the country if people then interpret that to mean that no matter what you're doing at a protest, if someone happens to be there who espouses a so-called Antifa ideology and commits a crime, that you were supporting that terroristic activity. It criminalizes all sorts of behavior that maybe is criminal in the underlying statute, but increases the potential penalty to a concerning degree.
You're in Minnesota. I think it's interesting to talk about that a bit because you've basically made the case that what's happening here is potentially the first of a new wave of prosecutions. And you've sort of laid out how this could all click together, and we'll see how the case actually plays out. And I'm saying it's interesting to talk to you because you're in Minnesota because, of course, there's a whole other prosecution happening where you are, which is the DOJ charging protesters there for entering a house of worship and live streaming their protest there. And what's important, I think, to note about this is like, this is not Texas. This is a blue state where this occurred, but you can see how the federal government can now involve itself, even if local prosecutors would maybe make a different choice than they would and charge people. This isn't domestic terrorism, but I wonder if you put that case in the same bucket with this Texas case is like, you need to be looking at all of these things together to understand how the federal government can be using its power in this moment and maybe will be using its power in the coming year or two.
Yeah, I think definitely it's all kind of part of the same playbook of just trying to tamp down on any protests that go against what the administration is attempting to achieve. Again, I believe in that case, there is, issues of trespass and more minor crimes that are being kind of escalated, that are being turned into larger, big picture offenses. In that case, it's more about, freedom from religious persecution.
Civil rights,
right. And it is an interesting thing to see first how they kind of weaponize civil rights laws against the very people that were often the ones that were meant to be the beneficiaries of those civil rights laws, especially in this church case here in Minnesota.
Because many of the protesters were Black.
Mm-hmm. And then in Texas, you have Second Amendment concerns as well. And in Minneapolis, Alex Preddy was allegedly armed at the time of his well, not at the time of his death, but before his death. And so you have the same kind of the right, both saying we have this Second Amendment right to protect ourselves from a tyrannical government, but also you don't have that Second Amendment right if you're a leftist, maybe. That's kind of the question of where do your Second Amendment rights stop in this kind of this administration's summation of what the Second Amendment is. But it's all kind of part of the same playbook of attempting to use whatever they can, whatever laws exist, stretch the existing laws to attempt to either prosecute protesters that they have arrested or create a chilling effect for anyone else who watches what they're doing and says, it's not worth it to me. I'm not going to show up to the protest.
If you were advising protesters right now, given everything we've just discussed, what would you say?
That's hard because, you want to advise people how to protect themselves, but some of the ways to protect yourself, if this is the reality moving forward, is inherently going to silence your ability to exercise your First Amendment right to show up in protest, to, be associated with ideological groups. So I think it just means that showing up to protests is more dangerous now for these reasons, because we have so many officers with body cam footage and a lot more conglomeration of data within the federal government that can cross over from, your TSA pre-check status to your, Social Security information. There's so much that can be impacted and that we are seeing happen to protesters, even if they're not even accused of a crime, that now is a consequence of showing up to a protest. And that is going to make people think twice about showing up to protest, which is their right to do. And so I think that at this point, the best way to protect yourself is to try and make sure that your ability to be identified in whatever surveillance footage the administration might have of you is harder, whether that's, wearing all black clothing, covering tattoos, wearing, a face mask and respirator, not only for your own safety, because they're increasingly deploying all sorts of various gas agents, but also to protect your identity, because it can come back to haunt you in ways that some would probably argue go beyond what the Constitution allows at this point.
Leeja, I'm really grateful for your time. Thanks for coming on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me.